Welcome. I'm Melva Persico. Come with me, meet new people, and share their experiences on this episode of Our Culture to the World. My guest today is Elsie Harry. Please introduce yourself to our guest, Elsie.
Hello, Melva. Thank you so much for having me. I am from Guyana, the land of many waters, and I'm from many places in Guyana, I feel, because I've lived in so many various places of my own country. But I've also lived in China for 2 years. And also I've lived in another Caribbean country, but for the purpose of this interview, we'll speak about my experiences in China, but I'm a Caribbean woman through and through. I am a spoken word artiste. And so I usually write and perform my own poetry. I'm a very big fan of the arts and about expressing aspects of your culture, of your life through your art. And also I use art as a means of speaking about social issues. And in my professional capacity, I am a sustainable community development officer for a non-governmental organization. So that's a little bit about me. And I hope that you will enjoy this conversation today.
Oh, I'm sure we will, and then we'll get to learn some more about you as we go on the conversation. Thank you so much, Elsie. So you mentioned that you lived in China for 2 years. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? Why? How did you end up in China? And what were your first impressions when you got there?
Everybody says that when they hear that I've lived in China, because they're like, why did you go halfway across the world? And my first answer is because I was yearning for a cultural experience. So when it was time to do my master's degree, I decided I'm going to study in China. And they said to me, but there are so many scholarships. Why don't you go to the UK? Why don't you go to the US? Why don't you go to Canada? And I was like, well, there's not such a big difference between the cultures of these places and the culture that I experienced in Guyana, especially with globalization. I just felt like China would give me a new and authentic experience into a culture that I did not have much information about. And I had taken a short Chinese course at the University of Guyana where I did my undergraduate degree. And that helped to even more pique my interest about the landmass that is known as China. And so I decided, okay, this is an excellent opportunity for me to go. I'm going to apply for a scholarship and I'm going to pack my bags and I'm going to go to China. And I did that.
Okay. So, I mean, as you said, you did a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about language later, but you took a short course before. But tell me, when you got there, I mean, learning the language, we learn a little bit about the culture and so on. But when you got there, what were your first impressions? Were there any culture shock experiences?
There were many culture shock experiences. First of all, because of the images that we usually see about China on TV and the stories that we usually hear about China, I did not expect China to be such a vibrant place. I feel like Chinese are people that are full of life. They're very expressive with the way that they dress. Like you can almost tell a person's personality by what they're wearing because their dressing style is so unique to them. So that is not something that I'm used to seeing on the streets of Guyana, for example. If people are going to work, they're just wearing something that looks professional. It's professional colors, blue, black, the traditional type of thing. But you would see a Chinese person going to work and you would not know that they're going to work because they're wearing something that we may term as outrageous, but it's them expressing themselves in their clothes, in the color of their hair. They would have blue hair, they would have red hair, they would have yellow hair. They are just very expressive with what they put on their body and how they present themselves to the world. And that is kind of the opposite of what you get told about China, because you get told, oh, it's a communist state. The government controls the people. They have a strict handle on them. They can't do this. They can't do that. And so I did not expect Chinese to be such expressive people who
Mhm.
basically wear their personalities. That was one. And two, China is so clean. I feel like you can pick up something and eat it off of the street. I feel like
Oh,
they have people around the clock just sweeping the road to make
wow.
sure that it just looks fantastic. All the buildings, the bridges, everything is just super clean. And that again was not something that I expected, because you always hear how China is so polluted, the smog colors the outside of the buildings and what's not. But that is not the case. It is sparkling clean. And then the third culture shock for me was that when you're walking down the street, you know how in Guyana and in other Caribbean countries, you say, hello, good morning, how are you doing? Hey. People walk silently down the street.
But
And if
nobody
you say
breathes.
hello, nobody greets. And if you say hello, they will look at you like, is
Where are you
everything
from?
okay with
Which
you?
planet? Which planet are
Which
you from?
planet are you from? Why are you talking to people in the middle of the street? They've just got this mentality where if I'm on the street, it's because I'm going somewhere purposefully. I have to get to, I don't have any time to dilly daddle. So they don't stop to greet. They don't say good morning. I would get into the subway and I would say good morning in Chinese. I would be like, oh, Zhao Shang Hao, Wan Shang Hao. And people would go, and they would whisper, "Oh, she's a Lao Wai. Lao Wai is a foreigner."
Foreigner.
Yeah, and it's not the nicest word for foreigner either. It's like
Okay.
a little bit of a mean word for a foreigner. They go, "Look at this Lao Wai. She's making so much noise." So that was a culture shock. Ooh, and another one that I think is important to mention. They don't eat on public transportation or in public places because they don't want you to litter. And so in some places where they don't want you to eat, they will have no chairs. So you would see a space in the airport, for example, and you would think, oh my gosh, why are there no chairs in this space? Why do I have to walk so far to find a chair and a table? And it's because they're directing you without speaking, without signs, to where you should eat. And in those spaces, they have receptacles where you can put your garbage. And on the bus and on the subway, they don't want you to eat at all. I did not know this. So your girl used to be in a hurry at mornings to get to places. And one time I was going to church and I got onto the bus. And once I was sitting on the bus, I took out my tea in my little bottle and I took out my sandwich and I drank my tea and I took a bite of my sandwich and I felt like eyes were staring at me. And when I looked around, everybody was in shock and horror at this foreigner eating on their bus. And so the guard, there's always a guard on the bus. They're called bao-ans. The bao-an starts to walk towards me with a stern look on his face. And I start packing up my food in my bag. And he gets to me and he starts shouting lots of things to me in Chinese. And part of it that I got was no eating on the bus. Don't eat in here. If you want to eat, you need to get off of the bus. And I'm like, sorry, due buchi. I didn't know. And so those are things that I had to adapt to really quickly if I wanted to have a good experience in China. And so those were my culture shocks.
Wow. But there's something you mentioned when you were talking about that church. How is that in China? Because I know of certain denominations that are totally outlawed in China. So you mentioned that you were going to church. So how does that work?
Well, that's another thing that I realized when I got there. So I was living in Beijing at this point because the first year was spent in Beijing and the second year in another city in China. And in Beijing, there are various churches. To establish a church, the persons who want to do so need to get permission from the government. And so they will do a background check to make sure it's not a cult because they don't want cults in China. And so once the church checks out, they will allow them to establish it. And of course, the churches will have rules that they should adhere to. one of the rules is that only the holders of international passports or foreign passports, non-Chinese passports, can attend the church.
Oh, so it means so the church is just for foreigners. It's not for
Yes.
Chinese. Oh,
And also Chinese who are foreign nationals holding foreign passports can attend the church as well.
oh,
Just
interesting.
not Chinese holding a Chinese
Is that?
passport.
Mm-hmm.
There are some churches that have permission for Chinese nationals to go to it, but that church that I was going to was not one.
Mm-hmm.
So our passports would get checked. Obviously, they know that I'm not Chinese, but your passport gets checked when you're entering the church. It's the responsibility of the church to check the documents of the persons coming. And other than that, it is pretty much like church anywhere else. You sing, you dance, we have prayer meetings. There's an offering, there are church activities like Sunday school, pretty normal stuff. And I was shocked at there being church options for me in China as well, because that's something else that many people think does not happen. Like they're like, oh, you'll not be able to go to church, but you can. They're just rules that govern having church in China.
Okay, interesting. So now you there as a student, and how was it adapting? I mean, you mentioned some of the things that were strange to you at first. So how were you able to adapt during your time there?
Okay, so the first thing I had to do was I needed to learn Mandarin, because you will find that many of the signs in China are not in English and Mandarin. Many of them are just in Mandarin, and not Mandarin that we can read, it's the characters. And so it was important for me to learn Mandarin if I wanted to be able to use the subway, for example, or if I wanted to communicate with people to purchase things in a store. I needed to be able to use the language, because there are not very many people outside of the university community that actually speak English. At your university, you will find that many of the teachers do speak English. A lot of the teachers have studied overseas for at least one of their degrees, and so they know English. But when you leave the university, you're just in the heart of China, and folks don't generally speak English. And so you either have to choose to rely on your translator, walk with your phone all the time and pray that your battery doesn't die, or you learn the language. So I learned the language, and what I realized once I learned the language, Chinese people on the street were nicer to me. I think that they respect you when you make the effort to learn the language. Even if you're speaking it poorly, they're so inclined to help you once they see you trying to speak to them. And so once I was able to learn a certain amount of Mandarin, my life got easier. I was able to go and buy my groceries, to ask them, oh, where can I get the best bargains? And they would direct me to the places that I needed to go to. And I was able to make friends with Chinese people who would take me around. They're very warm. Once you get to know them, they can seem a bit stoic at first, but once you speak the language and you can communicate with them and you know what they're saying to you, then it's like, oh, I would like to take you to dinner. Like random Chinese persons were taking me out to dinner, and I know it sounds really unsafe when I'm saying it right now, but random Chinese persons that I met took me out to dinner, took me out to lunch. And that's how I got to really integrate into Chinese society and learn where are the places I can go for different things. And that's how I was really able to adapt.
Right. Wow. Yes, and what you mentioned about language is so important, and that's true. People they really respect the effort you make to learn a foreign language, to learn their language, and you don't have to do it perfectly. But the fact that you're making the effort, they appreciate that, and they will work with you, and communication will take place.
Yeah.
So you were able to, as you said, you had a little bit of background, and then you were able to expand on that as you were there, and that made your life easier. Now, we talked about, your first impressions, your culture shock. But you, and in that you kind of mentioned a little bit of some things that people might term stereotypes, but I don't know if you wanted to expand a little bit on that in terms of maybe anything that, growing up in the Caribbean and living in the Caribbean and in Guyana, you may have heard, or, any kind of stereotypes that people in general may have about China and Chinese, that you, in addition to what you already mentioned, that you, when you got there and you were interacting with the people and living there, you were able to dispel.
Yeah, so one of the big things is that people usually tell you Chinese people are mean people. And Chinese people are not to be trusted. You can't trust Chinese people. But I found those two things to be absolutely incorrect. Because like I said, when I was able to speak the language, I realized that a lot of the persons were actually trying to help me or trying to befriend me, but I didn't know that. And a lot of them were intrigued by me. And so there is this thing called guanxi in Chinese language. And the simplest translation for it is relationship. And once Chinese people get to know you and they see that you're a nice person and that you have respect for their culture and their way of life, they will form guanxi with you. And once you have guanxi with a Chinese person, it's like a bond that cannot be broken. And so I made friends with a Chinese person first. I met her in Guyana. She was actually my teacher at Confucius Institute here in Guyana. And then she went back to China. But we formed guanxi. And so while I was in China, she said to me, "What are you doing for the holidays? Do you have a place to go?" And I was like, "Oh no, I was just gonna stay at my university, go to visit various sites." And she said, "You can come to my home and spend the holiday with my family." And because I had heard, oh, Chinese people are mean, they're not to be trusted, I was a little bit skeptical. But then I said, I'm gonna go. And when I went to her home, her family didn't speak English. That's one. Her mother and father didn't speak English. So they were just speaking to her in Mandarin. And she was translating for me. Not even Mandarin, actually. They spoke a dialect.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't speak Mandarin. They spoke a dialect from South China. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I can't right now. And they treated me like I was a member of their family. They were so warm. They were so inviting. Her mother would be saying to her, and she would be translating for me, that I shouldn't stay up late at night because it's bad for my health. And I was like, she's behaving like my mother. And at nights before I go to sleep, she would make me drink tea, because she makes all of her children drink tea at nights before they go to sleep, because she feels like this is healthy. And so all of the things that she did for her children, she did those things for me. And in the mornings, she would make breakfast for me every single morning religiously. I would wake up and she would, certain things I can understand, of course, and she would say to me, "Oh, your breakfast is on the table. I hope that you will like it. I hope that you're enjoying your time in my home." And this really broke a lot of stereotypes for me that I had been taught about Chinese people being mean, and you shouldn't trust them and they won't accept you if you're from a different place, especially the concept that Chinese don't like Black people. And so being in a home with Chinese people, staying there, I spent 2 weeks there, and I felt like I was just in a home of another person in Guyana, for example. It was just such a good experience that now when I hear people say that Chinese people are mean, I'm like, you can't just say that. Like, that is a myth. That is just absolutely a myth. And another thing is that they tell you that Chinese people are not to be trusted, right? That, oh, they'll scamp you, they'll scheme, and they'll do whatever. But I found that in China, a lot of the stores are not manned by people. You go into the store, you take what you need, you scan a QR code to pay for it. There's like no store attendant there. And I said to myself, aren't they afraid that people will steal things? And a Chinese person overheard me. And she said, Chinese are very honest people. And I said, Elsie, these are your unconscious biases that are speaking, because really and truly, you know nothing about China other than what you've been told or what you've seen in the media. It's now you have to approach it with a clear mind. And so I kept seeing these unmanned stores that you just go and you pick up your goods and you scan a QR code to pay, and there's nobody there to stop anybody from stealing anything. And then I kept taking transportation. I would travel by myself in a taxi, and I would just make the payment and no one would harm me. Or I would go to a store to buy something, and if I thought it was too expensive, I would bargain and they would lower the price. And I was like, these people are honest people, and I don't find anyone trying to scheme or scam me or steal anything from me. And so I was like, okay, these are two major stereotypes that we really have to get rid of, because essentially Chinese people are just people with a different culture. And like any other place, there are good people and bad people, but you cannot paint the whole population with a broad brush to say, oh, there is this kind of people and that's it.
But tell me something, in terms of race, because you mentioned a little bit about that at the beginning, as an African descendant woman in China. How was that for you?
First of all, Chinese people are very curious about people that look like me. They don't see very many Afro descendants. That's one. And two, they're very intrigued by our hair, because their hair is straight and it lies flat. So when they see this hair on your head, they automatically wonder if it's hair or not, if it's really hair or if it's something that you've put into your hair. So they all touched my hair without my permission. They would just run up to me and grab it. And I had to say, oh my gosh, please don't touch me. Please. I had to learn how to say that in Mandarin. Please don't touch me. Please don't touch my hair. And they would say, gender tofama, is your hair real? Is your hair real? And so after getting this question a few times, I realized that they think that what their hair looks like is the only way that real hair looks, because they don't see other kinds of hair very often. And so I had to explain to them that, yes, this is the hair that I grew from my scalp, and also that I locked it. I locked my hair, and I would show them pictures of Bob Marley because they're familiar with reggae music. And I would say, well, you see his hair? It's his hair as well. He grew it. And they would say, oh, okay. And then they would rub my skin. And I always wondered, why are they rubbing my skin? And so I had a conversation with a Chinese person about it who spoke English to find out. And they said, I'm so ashamed to tell you, when they rub your skin and they're looking at their hands after rubbing it, they're checking to see if the dirt will come off. They think that underneath this brown skin, there's skin like theirs. And that maybe I'm dirty or I need to take a shower, and that's why my skin has this color. And so they rub it and they look at their hand and they always look shocked, like, why isn't it coming off? And so that was very weird for me, because I thought that with a globalized world, everybody has to know that there are people of various races, but not necessarily so. And so what they told me is that people who are from the big cities, who are actually from Beijing, Shanghai, and these places, they know. But people who are from the rural parts of China, who also migrate to these big cities, they may not have interacted with a person that looks different. So it's their very first experience, and that's why they're behaving so frantically, looking at your hair, touching your skin. And so I use it as a teaching moment to say to them, you know, I'm a person of African descent, and this is my skin, this is my hair. And sometimes I did experience prejudice. There is curiosity, and then there is prejudice. And sometimes I did experience prejudice and racism, because I could hear people saying in Mandarin, oh, you know, I wonder if they wear clothes where they come from, or they're so poor they probably can't afford food to eat. That's why they came to China. And oh, look at her, she's an African, she came from Africa, and they're poor there, and that's why she needed to come here to seek better opportunities. And so there's definitely prejudice, and there's definitely racism. Like sometimes I sat on the subway and people would move away from me and hold their noses, even though I was not smelly. And so there are definitely those persons who are racist and prejudiced. But I feel like majority of Chinese are just curious, or they're uninformed about people from different places. And once you take a moment to try to explain to them where you're from, that there are people who look like me in my country, lots and lots of us all over the world, I feel like then they're like, oh, okay, I need to look into this. I need to research this. I need to learn more about the outside world.
Yes. And then, as you said, you know, really, there are people, the few incidents of racism or prejudice that you may have experienced, they're all over the world. You know, we have that. So, you know, and the good experiences outweigh the bad, I'm sure.
Most definitely, most definitely.
Yeah. So now, before, there was something else I wanted to talk about, but now I'm thinking about food, because, you know, in Guyana, we have this, you know, Chinese food is a big thing in Guyana. We got a lot of big Chinese restaurants, and we usually boast that the Chinese food in Guyana is the best Chinese food. But how was that for you now in terms of food when you went to China? Was it the same kind of Chinese food that you were used to in Guyana in the Caribbean, or was it different? What was that like?
Well, that's a shocker. I've got a shocker for your viewers. The food that you've been eating in Guyana and in the Caribbean and even in the US as Chinese food is not really Chinese food. They actually call that Western Chinese food, because all of the things that make it, give it the big flavor, make it so flavorful and so tasty that make people buy it, they don't use those in China. Chinese food of itself is actually a little bit bland. And so when I got to China and we went to a restaurant, persons were ordering fried rice. And when the fried rice came out, I was like, that's not Chinese fried rice. Look at me saying in China, that's not Chinese fried rice, because that's not the Chinese fried rice that I've been seeing in Guyana. But that's not what it looks like. It's not as dark in color. I guess it doesn't have as much soy sauce. Yeah, and it has lots of vegetables. It looks very healthy. And then they don't typically eat a lot of fried rice to begin with. They like a lot of plain rice actually with their meals, and even the rice that they eat is a special kind of rice that they grow in China that sticks together because they have to pick it up with the chopsticks.
Oh yeah,
So their rice.
Oh, sorry, no,
Sorry?
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. I'm going to say it afterwards.
Okay, so the rice isn't as grainy as our rice, and so the fried rice is made with that sticky rice, and it's not so colored and all those different things, and their plain rice is also the sticky rice, we call it, because they have to pick it up with the chopsticks. They don't generally use knives and forks and spoons. And so even eating that rice was just a totally different experience because this is not what is served in the Chinese restaurants here in Guyana.
So chopsticks, were you able to adapt to using chopsticks?